Okay, good. Welcome. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm beyond excited to be here with all of you here at Lighthouse Bookshop and online. I'm Lea Lockhart, and I'll be guiding the discussion tonight. But before we get started, I want to ask everyone who's here in the bookshop to keep your masks on while we're in the building. And I wanted to let you know that you can buy a copy of Queer Data while you're here. Folks online, I've just been told, I think the sale of or availability of books online is temporarily low.
Temporarily low, but good at the Lighthouse. There are ample copies here.
Yeah, perfect. So if you want to order online, you might have to wait a wee bit. Otherwise, come on down. So like I said, I'll be guiding a discussion tonight, and I want to introduce the panel. And I'll start with Kevin Guyan, the author of Queer Data. And Kevin is a researcher whose work explores the intersection of data and identity, particularly as it relates to LGBTQ people in the UK. And he's a research fellow in the School of Culture and Creative Arts at the University of Glasgow, and previously worked for a higher education organization that focuses on equality, diversity, and inclusion among staff and students in university and colleges. And we're here as well with Jovan, who will join us later on. And Jovan is the program director at Intercultural Youth Scotland, IYS, the national charity for Black and people of colour, POC, children and young people. IYS is a movement-building organisation combining advocacy and community work in the areas of youth work, employment, education, and mental health. IYS is a community, a support, and an advocate for Black and POC children and young people in Scotland. Jovan's reflections center on the value of data, the value of data in advocacy and community work, alongside seeing the research process itself as a site for structural oppression presented by UK population surveys. Their research focuses on the perspective of those currently overlooked in survey data, and after their PhD, hope to continue researching the social and political significance of LGBTI plus population estimates, and to keep irritating those who wish to force us into binary boxes. Thank you all, and I'm in good company, and I'm Lea Lockhart. I'm a freelance design researcher and facilitator, and as a facilitator, I bring people together for collective decision making, and as a design researcher, I try to help or irritate organizations and institutions to know whether or not their policies and services are working for people, largely people who are invisibilized and ignored. And I'm also co-convener of the Design Justice Network node in Scotland. And that's a global community of people working to design justice. So the format for tonight is I'll be speaking to Kevin for about 45 minutes to about 7:45. Then we're going to have a wee break, and then we're going to bring Kirsty and Jovan up and have a chat for about half an hour. And then we'll hand things over to the audience and wrap up at 8:30.
Sounds perfect.
Is that right? Perfect. Okay, so just by way of a brief introduction to Queer Data, to the book, it's a hugely important book and very much anticipated. I've been waiting for over a year for this book to be published. And it's the first book to look at queer data, defined as data relating to gender, sex, sexual orientation, and trans identity in history. And current data practices reflect an incomplete account of LGBTQ lives, and Queer Data will help us understand how data biases are used to delegitimize the everyday experiences of queer people. And Kevin, a sort of core tenet of the book, is that data collection about LGBTQ people may be beneficial in some ways, and it may be detrimental in other ways. So what are the ways, or what are the potential benefits and harms that you see?
Great. Well, thank you first of all, Lea, for that fantastic introduction of the book and the panel and the audience. Thank you for joining us in person and online as well. So with the book, what I really hope to do, and the idea of queer data, I guess it's kind of twofold. So on one hand, the book has information about data on LGBTQ lives and experiences, both quantitative and qualitative data. But running alongside that is the kind of querying of the methods we use to capture data about LGBTQ lives, communities, and beyond. So actually all types of quantitative and qualitative methods. And I think having that kind of dual approach to kind of those two sides of queer data, for me, exposed some of the problems and the challenges when it comes to what happens kind of at that intersection between data about data and LGBTQ lives. So I think there's a lot on the benefits already. There's a lot of celebrations about why it's important to collect data, the uses of data, how we can use data to improve information about housing, health, economics, how we can use it to lobby politicians, change things in the media, but less so on the negative sides. So I think increasingly when I wrote the book, I was keen to shine a light on some of the pitfalls, issues, challenges in the engagement of LGBTQ communities and data practices. So for me, the book, there's many of them. I'll maybe share one. I think as I found, particularly, I kind of got onto this topic by doing some work around the census in Scotland. So for the first time, the census next March is going to ask new questions on sexual orientation and transgender identity. On paper, that sounds great. That sounds really exciting and really promising and a real step forward. But as Kirsty might also mention, who's also worked on this topic quite a bit, there are a lot of downsides to that as well. So my engagement in the design process for the census found that actually the ideas about who is being counted in a census did not necessarily reflect the views of the LGBTQ communities. It was often how a cis heterosexual majority perceived an understandable version of that. So the questions we ended up with very much flattened, diluted, squeezed people into boxes that they maybe didn't quite fit in order to make sense to those in existing positions of power. So I think we see that across all different types of identity and data, and that kind of dual side of it, that if we want to kind of get the benefits of it, we need to play by the rules of the game, but we're not necessarily writing those rules. They're being written by other people who maybe don't always have our best interests at heart.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it's hitting on something I've been talking to people in a global community I'm part of, which is what you lose when you name something. So while sort of labeled identities or named identities can be a site of belonging and community, they can also be sites of loss because of what you've just explained. So thanks so much for that. So in my experience working with public services, mainly with central governments, is different services and policy areas have this sort of set of extrinsic motivations on them to consider equality, diversity, and inclusion. So some of this might be requirements to carry out things that are called equalities impact assessments, which sometimes is like a literal tick box to say, you know, are you potentially harming this community as opposed to this one? And in government in Scotland, there's a huge push for user-centered design and human-centered design coming in. So there's these extrinsic motivations, but they don't seem to be leading to people having a desire to build relationships with marginalized communities especially, or to have a deeper understanding of what the issues are for those people. In the book, you talk about what I think I've seen, which is this perpetual state of collecting data. So it's like this distraction by data collection. If we just had more data, we could know the problem and act on it. And this seems to just be going on and on and on instead of building relationships, bringing people in. So what role do you think data can play in actually blocking or even working against social justice?
That was a beautiful summation of the problem. And I think when writing this book, I was really keen for it to reach people who weren't just working in universities. It's not just for academics, it's not just for scholars, it's for folk working in charities, public sector, private sector. I think the kind of tentacles of the equality, diversity, inclusion industry have kind of stretched into all areas of life now. And I think regardless of where you're working, you'll have come across these demands for data, this idea around if we just, as you're saying, collect more and more data, it'll somehow solve the problem. And I think I'm definitely not wanting to say there's no need or no demand for data. The book highlights the many benefits of it, but it kind of charts the life course of data from collection through to analysis and use, and actually the rationale for why are we collecting this data. And often, particularly in my work with kind of equality and diversity practitioners, sometimes people losing sight of why are we actually doing this, why are we collecting the data, and the actual collection of the data becomes the purpose of the exercise rather than what it's trying to solve or crack.
Right.
So it's something which I'm really trying to push back against. I think we all just have finite resources, finite time, finite money. Do we want to be spending all of that or lots of that on big data collection exercises?
Right.
When often, particularly around LGBTQ communities, we know what the problem is. We have enough evidence of that. There's enough studies, there's enough consultations, enough stakeholder engagement sessions. The step now is getting on with the job.
Right.
And that distractive use of data, that data as a means to kind of jam the system or to block progressive change or to delay things and postpone things to a later date, is something which I hope the book will help people push back against.
Yeah.
And I hope that when people read it, and if maybe this is the third time their manager has suggested, let's run a study on how the LGBTQ staff feel about this issue,
Right.
they can actually go, no, we don't need to do that. Let's just get on fixing the issue.
Fabulous, thank you. And throughout the book, you cite a number of organizations and movements that work to use data to advance racial justice. For example, Data for Black Lives, Algorithmic Justice League, hashtag AfroCensus, just to name a few, and a whole host of Black scholars and practitioners like Ruha Benjamin, Joy Buolamwini, Kimberly Crenshaw, to name a few. How has the work of these organizations and people helped you develop your understanding of using gender, sex, and sexuality data for action?
Oh, wow, it's a big question. I would say it's foundational. I would say a lot of my ideas that I've kind of maybe built on and kind of reviewed and looked at and tried to apply to LGBTQ issues and kind of queer lives, a lot of that is coming from work around racial justice. A lot of it, some of it quite recent work as well, particularly in light of Black Lives Matter. And I think that kind of critical ideas about systems and structures and institutions and administrative practices and kind of what are they and aren't they doing, I think I've learned a huge amount from the kind of amazing list of scholars and activist groups you've mentioned there. And I think they often, quite a lot of them will write about how those who are maybe best placed to see what's wrong with a system, whether it's a diversity monitoring form or a census or a registration form for a GP, are those who are being kind of shafted by the system.
Yeah.
So actually minoritized groups, whether it's along lines of race or class or sexuality or gender, are often best placed to kind of see where things aren't working.
Yeah.
So I think that's maybe one side. The knowledge is definitely hugely informed my work. But I guess maybe the second strand is also on a personal level, me thinking about what can I bring to this as a kind of cis, white, gay man, where is it my space to be engaged, how do I engage with ideas of racial justice and how do I use them in a meaningful way that's not extractive, that's trying to do them justice but not take them on as my own.
Right.
And I think writing the book and trying to engage with those ideas was quite challenging. And actually even speaking about them is sometimes quite challenging, but I think having that ability to kind of stop and think, what can I bring to this?
Right.
When should I step back and kind of try and give space has been a kind of learning curve, which I'm still trying to kind of learn through as well. So yeah, I guess it's kind of dual sides. But maybe also a shout out for in Scotland, the work of Intercultural Youth Scotland, which Jovan will say more about later on, for me was also an inspiration when writing this book. So I was involved in some of the early research when they were just kind of launching as an organisation, and it did give me insight into how we can do punchy, radical research that's actually going to be not for a journal article or not for an academic book. It's actually going to be something we can take to politicians and policymakers and go, here is the evidence, do something about it. And again, that kind of ballsy attitude, I quite like.
Yeah, well, me too. Well done. You have been giving talks and presentations for quite a while in the run-up to the publication of the book. And I'm wondering if any of the arguments or messages in the book, if there are any of them that seem to be more misunderstood or questioned than others, and what things seem to be resonating the most with people? What do you find yourself having to sort of explain more thoroughly or even protect, I guess, or defend?
Yeah, it's another really good question. I think one of the one of the issues I find quite hard to explain is I've been doing a lot of things online. This is my first in-person event for many months or years. And I think what I usually have these very bright slides, these kind of bold slides with very bold lettering and language, and one will be kind of less data, more action will be one of my kind of buzz lines. I sometimes think, are people misunderstanding what I'm saying here?
Right.
Somebody who's working in data, this is kind of my employment, my practice, my writing is all around data, and here's me standing in a platform saying we need less data.
Right.
And I think that kind of nuanced argument about when is it important to collect data and when do we realise we're at saturation point is sometimes quite, I think, difficult to convey.
Yeah.
I think particularly when we think about LGBTQ data across different geographies as well. So I think I'm very much writing as somebody based in Scotland, writing about work in Scotland, in the UK, and kind of seeing some of the challenges we're facing here, some of the limitations of data, but my views on that wouldn't be the same if I was looking at stuff in other geographies, other LGBTQ rights movements, other contexts where data is maybe at a different stage of being used as well. So I think the nuance as to when we should and should not be collecting data is sometimes quite hard to convey. But hopefully people don't think I'm just saying don't collect data.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're getting the kind of shades of grey there.
This is a really broad brush I'm using to ask this question, but do you think we're at a sort of different level of data maturity in our organizations and institutions with regard to LGBTQ data as compared to other areas of the world that you were looking into?
I think so. I think it's something which I'm trying to learn more about, if I'm being honest. I think in the broader work and writing and activism around social justice and LGBTQ rights, and this sense that there isn't one way of achieving that, there isn't one path, there isn't one white Western global path for how LGBTQ people achieve social justice and liberation. It's going to be contextual, it's going to differ.
Right.
And I think some of my work in other national contexts, there is that problem of people thinking what's happening in Western countries should just be supplanted into other geographies, that to be liberated you have to get rights, recognition, be counted in the census, ... and then the end point is everyone's free and happy.
Right.
But actually, things don't always work in that linear fashion.
Right.
And I think, where does data fit into that kind of linear trajectory of change, and just thinking that change can operate in really messy, complicated ways, whether it's across different sectors in the UK or different geographies internationally. So I think having that nuance and not just thinking that what's happening in a Western context should be copied and used elsewhere has been an eye-opener. I've done a small amount of work on LGBTQ data in Asian countries, around kind of queer Asia, and that's just really fascinating to how that works in a different geographical context.
Right.
But I don't know enough about it yet to say more. But it's really interesting, so I'd encourage folk to take a look.
Well, I want to pick up on that kind of plug and play thing, and I'm just wondering if some people have heard you and know that you've written this book, and have you been approached at all for like, how do I do the queer data? What is the shortcut in the playbook type of conversation?
It's probably the number one question people ask. The amount of emails I've received since the book came out last week from people who are looking for blog posts or things, particularly with LGBT History Month.
Right.
This is the perfect, whether it be tick box or thing to kind of roll out their staff on how do we embed a queer data approach in our work, which is great. There's that enthusiasm for the practice and approach, but it's not as easy as here is a plug and play approach, as you mentioned. I think it's more of a mindset. When I run talks, I often don't provide much answers. It's often more questions or prompts, or I hope that people kind of read the book or come to a talk and go, hold on, that's a new way of thinking about that idea.
Yes.
So I rarely provide answers. It's more reflections.
Yes,
I think.
yes, I like that. So a main thrust of the book is that data collection is not apolitical and it is not untouched by researcher bias. And this flies in the face of various conventions held in different professional arenas where objectivity is claimed to be a thing and is actually something that's pursued or aspired to. And in my government world, we see this in the Civil Service Code. Two pillars of the Civil Service Code are objectivity and political impartiality. And you can imagine for researchers that might sting a little bit. So I'm curious to know what your experience is of working around or with expectations of objectivity in academic environments and higher education.
Again, a really fantastic question that touches on so many chapters of the book. I think maybe my approach to this has maybe been informed by my background. So I'm fairly new to work around data, particularly around quantitative data. My background's in history, in gender history, in qualitative methods very much. But kind of coming to quantitative data and quantitative methods in the past couple of years, I hopefully brought that kind of more critical qualitative approach to quantitative methods. And for me, it was such an eye-opener to be doing work around the census and to be people to be treating this, what is a large quantitative data exercise, as some sort of apolitical, ahistorical artifact that people that kind of they dug up, and it was just there sitting perfectly perfectly constructed. Whereas actually, I mean, as soon as I engaged in the process, I could see this was all about politics. This was all about people trying to bring their view to the discussion and inform policymakers in a variety of ways, myself included. So I was very much involved as a researcher, but very much coming at it from a particular angle. So I think having that critical view to actually particularly quantitative methods and going, actually, these are designed, these are manipulated, these are managed, these are serving particular agendas, I think for me was really, really key. And I think what I hopefully get across in the book is, again, people having that critical eye to a range of different research methods, a range of different experts, actually scratching the surface. If somebody says they're an academic, still challenging their views and not just taking their word as gospel. And I think what we'll see also around the census is this kind of, I guess, presenting stuff as if it's fact. And I think I kind of come back to this view that the numbers never lie a lot in the book. What does actually do? It's how we frame them, how we present them. I started one chapter looking at anecdotal and gender pay gap data. This is something that people will come across in a range of different sectors. And gender pay gap data can be calculated. This is the gap between the earnings of male staff and female staff in an organisation. But there are a huge variety of ways we can calculate that quantitative data, a huge variety of ways we can present that data, a huge variety of ways it can be weaponised for good and bad purposes. Right. And I think we see that across a range of issues. So it'll be interesting when the census is done and the results are published, how that data is weaponised for a variety of good and bad purposes.
Yeah. What do you think about when you fast forward to the census return? What are your sort of visions? What do you think we'll hear?
This would be interesting to speak to Kirsty about as well. I think good and bad. I think it's a fantastic thing that it's been expanded to include to count sexual orientation, to count trans status and history. But I would never want to uncritically celebrate this moment. I would have concerns that there will be an undercount. So the full extent of the LGBTQ population won't be counted for a variety of reasons. One fundamental point, the census doesn't count non-binary. It's going to be a kind of binary compulsory question on sex. But beyond that, this undercount and this people not engaging in the census for a variety of reasons will mean that the percentage we get at the end of the day won't be fully representative of the population. So my worry is if that number is a lot lower than we maybe think it is, what are the political ramifications of that? Right. So if we all maybe think the LGBTQ population of Scotland is maybe 5%, maybe 7%, actually if the census, this big, robust data exercise comes back and says it's 1% or 2%, right. What's the kind of trickle-down effect of that for funding, for the media, for service provision for LGBTQ communities? So I do have that worry, and I think, again, how we present data, we always need to make clear that it is going to be an undercount, it is going to be a poor representation of the reality, and I think having that, again, critical eye to how we speak about data, how we speak about quantitative data, I think is really key. Yeah,
thank you for that. Ultimately, queer data is a call to action. So using gender, sex, and sexuality data for action and queering research methods, all of this is hands-on deck stuff. This is such an accessible read, and I think throughout there are frameworks, conceptual frameworks, tools, tricks of the trade for people to get them thinking. They're not answers, but there's a lot in it that can help people modify practice, use data for action. It's very practical. And at the end of the book, you offer us 8 queer questions for people who collect, analyze, and use gender, sex, and sexuality data. And for what it's worth, I think these 8 queer questions are portable. I think anyone doing research, qualitative research especially, into any marginalized community could take these queer questions and apply them to their work. On a practical note, how and when do you apply these questions to your research work? And do you have any suggestions for people who are listening to us tonight about how they can sort of use these queer questions, especially if they don't know where to start?
A very good question. That is what I hoped the book would do. So I do try and round it off with something that's very action focused, very practical. Again, something that doesn't relate to research per se. So this applies to people who are maybe working in an HR department and running a kind of small staff survey, or people engaged in doing an evaluation piece for their charity, or if they're sitting in a kind of trust or an arts group or something. I wanted something to be portable, so I really like that that's your kind of reading of it. In my work, I would probably say, in theory, it should be embedded throughout this approach. I should be doing this from the get-go, doing it throughout the process, but I also think it was something that was quite iterative. It kind of, that list of 8 kind of queer prompts at the end of the book was something that grew throughout the book as I engaged with more work, read more pieces, had amazing conversations with a range of activists, scholars, practitioners working in different fields. So that was kind of maybe for me, when writing the book, that's what I kind of arrived at the end point. I think when starting on a new piece of work, I should now be going back to those 8 questions and working through them and thinking, how do they inform my practice? In regards to kind of, I guess, a main takeaway or a kind of an action, I think maybe sometimes there's a missing step when people embark on new pieces of work. As I mentioned earlier, we only have so many hours in a day, we only have so much money, so much energy, so much resources to be doing work around equality, diversity and inclusion. And I think often we miss that step that should happen before we even reach step 1, is about, do we need to do this?
Yeah.
I think there's sometimes a sense of, like, we have the equality and diversity budget is £5,000, let's spend it on doing a staff survey.
Right.
But actually, is that necessarily the best use of that money? I kind of write how maybe the money would be better spent putting it in people's pockets to pay bills or to doing things which are maybe outside the box. And I return to this kind of issue about, do we need more evidence of the problem? So kind of my work's now moving to space about what is the role of data in conceptualising problems, improving problems, and increasingly, particularly in Scotland and around LGBTQ rights and reform of things like the Gender Recognition Act, I increasingly see that actually, irregardless of how much evidence we have, irregardless of how much data we have, irregardless of how good that data is, it doesn't actually change the situation. So in the situation in England, for example, they ran a huge consultation on reform of the Gender Recognition Act. The consultation came back kind of saying that it should be reformed, but ultimately the UK government made the call not to do it. So again, it makes me think, what's the role of data and evidence in these, in bringing about change? And actually, will we just end up accumulating this amazing data, but it doesn't actually do anything to kind of push open that door? So I think that's a real key starting point for any piece of work or any research, is to think, do we need to do this?
Yeah, and I think it's one of my main frustrations in design research is often people start by conducting new research instead of looking back at what they're sitting on, and then looking at it with a critical eye, of course. So it's this kind of, again, this generating more data as an inaction. Yeah,
and I think that point you've raised there is really key as well, because often if we're just recreating the wheel or just going through the motions again, what is that doing to the kind of the subjects of the research, the people that we're engaging with? If we're asking them again to tell us about their experiences, their lives, actually that's a toll on the participants in these projects. And I've had increasing concerns as well about if we're amassing more and more data about what we're perceiving as problems, so whether it's LGBTQ lives or the experiences of queer people, actually, if all of that data is about bad things,
Right.
what's that doing for how people are being represented?
Yeah.
If all of our data on LGBTQ people is about hate crime, bullying, harassment, suicide, poor mental health,
Yeah.
actually, we're just swamped in bad data.
Right.
And I think, again, thinking when can we just stop and actually start trying to address what is the kind of root cause of the issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. So we're going to wrap up with one question before we take a break and bring Jovan and Christian. And I want to know what your soundtrack to queer data is.
Oh, wow. Soundtrack. Okay, so caveat, I'm not really a big music listener.
Well, you know,
So-
it could be the radio or...
So, okay, I can think of two things. So one, for the kind of the more musical side of it, I'm just going to copy the playlist for one of the best books I read last year, which is Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lynn.
Okay.
So I was a massive fan of that book. I love the mix of kind of memoir and all the venues. But also it has a fantastic Spotify playlist.
Oh, amazing.
So that has been, I guess, a playlist at the launch, around the launch of Queer Data, that informed some of my work. And I guess I am more of a fan of podcasts.
Yep.
So I will also cite a podcast. For me, it's this fantastic podcast called Bad Gays.
Oh, right. Okay.
So this is a podcast by two researchers and writers. One's called Hugh Lemmy, other one's called Ben Miller. And it's basically about problematic, mainly gay men from history,
Okay.
which I think is a real tonic to some of the stories,
Yeah.
some of the framings of LGBTQ history, and particularly key for LGBT History Month, next month as well. So in the writing of the book, there's a lot of runs. I mean, this was in the midst of lockdown, a lot of solitary runs, listening to podcasts about bad gays from
Right.
history. So I can tell you all about Liberace, Truman Capote,
Oh,
all
no.
these bad gays. So I would definitely recommend that as a list. And it did definitely inform many sections of the book.
Oh, that's really... I'm an obsessive podcast listener, so I will be picking that up for sure. Okay, we're going to take a break for... What do you want to say? 5 minutes? Yeah.
Come for a break.
We'll break for 5 minutes, and then we'll get sorted with Jovan and Christy, and then we'll pick up in 5 minutes.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Kevin. Yay! Good, yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're coming back. Welcome, Johan, Kritzy. I have a question for both of you to start off. And so the work of activist researchers or people working in social justice-centered organizations can feel lonely, it can feel frustrating, it can feel emotionally taxing. And has this been your experience or your organization's experience? And if so, how do you and your colleagues keep well, especially when you might be having difficult conversations or repetitive conversations with certain stakeholders? Yeah, how do you keep well in this kind of work? Who wants to jump in first?
I can go.
For it.
Yeah, I think sometimes I'll go to an event, or I'll say go to an event, I'll be zooming into some sort of thing, and I'll be like, oh, other people care about this. It's like anytime I've talked to Kevin, I'm like, oh, someone else that cares. Fantastic, it's not just me. So I think that's the most helpful thing, not just like thinking that I'm just like, it's just me in my room just doing this thing and then going, what's the point? Is there a point? It's like, okay, there is a point. And yeah, I think for me personally also, I just go, I've got flatmates, I just go and pester them. I'm just like, hi. They work in third sector, so I'll just go and talk to them about stuff and about my relationship to work, and like, that's, yeah, I think personally that's the main thing I do.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, just because of the kind of organization that IOS is, we're mainly people of color working in IOS, and the kind of spaces that we're in, we're often the person of color who's supposed to be the one talking about race, advocating around race, supporting other people of color around race, supporting learning around anti-racism, and so because of that, it's a big question within IOS, honestly, and I can't say that we're perfectly there at this point as well. It's been a really long period of growth and getting into those spaces and making sure we're really pushing for the things we need to do. So really, the name of the game this year is really focusing on that, because, because we've really been able to feel, whether we're sitting in the classroom or in an advocacy space, or anywhere else that we're working, supporting a young person through experience of racism or something like that, there's so much kind of emotional work to do, so much kind of that you just have to take in and absorb all of the time, whether it's someone else's pain or your own over what's happening, because you're kind of this lightning rod. And I'd say what we've kind of especially coming from all of the staff at IOS in that sense, right, has really come up as the way to deal with this, the way to engage with this, is really establishing that clear sense of solidarity between each other and support for each other, right? And I think it's part of the reason that staff have kind of sought out being in IOS as well, because if you're going to do anti-racism work, it's nice to do it amongst a whole community of other people who are dealing with the same issues, both in terms of just lived experience, but also in terms of having to be the one who's out there doing it, So yeah, that's it's not perfect. It's not everything.
No.
I think even if we get to that point. But have to do it somehow.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think I'm seeing more and more conversations in sort of design research world and user research world about folks either requesting or having built into working contracts therapy or counseling, or having time explicitly for journaling, for example, doing something that's a bit off, not off the clock, but off the job a little bit to do some reflection, and then hopefully some reflexive things around that. So I'd advocate for more of that if possible. Okay, I have a question for you, Johan, but feel free to pitch in if you have anything to say. So throughout the book, Kevin talks about queering data collection methods, and this is to help us as readers critically consider whose interests are actually being centered when organizations collect data about marginalized groups. So querying data collection methods might look like more reciprocal, more fluid, more modular, more porous methods than we typically see in social sciences and in qualitative research. And I know your work includes looking at research processes as sites of structural oppression and alienation. I love that. And therefore sites of anti-racist change. So what are your thoughts about how organizations can develop more reciprocal and less exploitative relationships with groups they research.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. It's. I think you two touched on it earlier as well, right? Just in kind of going through questions about the book, and yeah, there's simply that starting point of, as oppressed communities in general, we are very used to being researched,
Right.
incredibly used to being researched, and often used to being researched and then nothing more.
Right.
Right. Like in terms of the research process and the outcomes of the research, even seeing the outcomes of the research, nothing. Right. So.
Right.
There is, I mean, I guess in a very kind of like, I don't know, policy or academic terms, we're talking like participatory research in that sense. In terms of talking about what are we trying to work towards in terms of changing the power dynamic within that. But I mean, maybe making it more straightforward than talking about participatory research or something. I think we have to get out of that space of talking about research as if, with particularly when we talk about marginalization, structural oppression, as you talk to this marginalized group, and then you go away and you do your interpretation work on your own, and then you release a piece of research, you release whatever you're and releasing at the end, right? And then there's no feedback mechanism at all, and that's really it. For me, then it comes down to how are you very clearly, very straightforwardly accountable to the people that you're researching.
Right.
Maybe it's a general research question, but very specifically when we're talking about researching oppressed communities. And that's, I mean, just in the sense, I mean, I guess in the spirit of you kind of putting those eight kind of questions at the end to kind of like spark how to actually go about this kind of work.
Right.
I'd say, like, why not just start with just forging ahead with a standard part of research on oppressed communities should be at the very end, like the last person who gets to actually review and edit what's going on are the actual people that you've researched, right? I mean, I think there's all kinds of things we can think about, like how does that work with the research process and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you can really feel the difference just as a researcher in that moment of like the interpretation and I mean, I guess, you know, the fancy way of saying the violence that you're enacting on participants' inputs.
Yeah.
You can really feel it if you know you're going to have to go back to that person and say, hey, this is what I thought you were saying.
Right.
And then what comes out of that. And I think it's good, it makes the data better as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, then there's a whole extra thing to say about the identity of the researchers themselves. If you're interpreting, it matters, like lived experience matters.
Yeah.
Understanding of the oppression that you're talking about matters.
Yeah.
Most of the time, especially in policy making, but I'd say also in academia, we only talk about one or the other.
Right.
Right. So, a person of color without any kind of background in anti-racism who's kind of been forced into this position of being the race person, or a white academic who has specialized in anti-racism and can't connect into the lived experience. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Kirsty, do you have anything to pitch
I
Any reflections?
agree so much. Like the amount of times, like I've definitely participated in research myself. The reporters came out and I'm like, well, they've completely misrepresented everything that was said. And yeah, in my own work, so for my focus group participants, there was 2 different stages of feedback. There was 2 feedback sheets. The first one was all participants were sent a summary of what I thought they said, so they could say to me, nope, that was not what was said, you were wrong. They didn't say that, but luckily they were able to provide clarification if there was anything they forgot. They could be like, oh, this as well, which was so helpful. And then they were also kind of used as a sort of steering group where they were sent the final sort of results of my research. And I was like, how does this fit with what you shared with me like almost a year ago now?
Yeah.
And that kind of process, I don't understand doing it without that process, because if not, you'd just be thinking, if I completely misrepresented everything that they said, and it just becomes like justifying your own perspective rather than actually like representing the people. Because like I know that not every researcher thinks this, but personally as a researcher I think like my job is to represent what they say. That's it. Like represent what they say and to try and like if possible turn it into to act on it. It's not to use what they say to like defend my particular perspective or whatever. My perspective should change based on what they say.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like that feedback loop is really important.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you were saying as well, it becomes even more important when there's the whole sort of positionality of the person conducting the research, and like even as an in-group researcher, I'm in group for my very specific way that I am overlooked in surveys. That I will not be overlooked in the same way that everyone else is, and I'm also, even people who are like someone else who's non-binary and queer, their perspectives on it might be completely different, the way that they talk about it might be completely different, so asking for further clarification is essential as part of that communication there, and I can't just assume, oh well, I know so making sure that that's there is really important.
Perfect, thank you for that. That's a good segue into a question I have that I want you to kick us off with. So in the book, Kevin asks us to have difficult conversations with other people and with ourselves, and to ask, is it my place to speak? So can you talk to this idea of insider, outsider, and how you suggest overrepresented people can assess when or if it's their place to speak on behalf of others?
So personally, I like, when thinking about the sort of research I would, so I'm a sort of, my background in training is very methods focused, so I could kind of try my hand at anything. But when thinking about the sort of research I would want to help in or lead, there's a different, like, so I am a white person, I'm able-bodied, so with that, I'm like, I should not be in a position of leadership in these sort of research roles. So thinking and making that clear, I'm like, if there's any way that my research skills can be an assistance, smashing, great. But I should not be in charge in any way, shape or form. And so I previously done produced like training for people wanting to work with LGBTQ plus people, and kind of what Kevin was saying about thinking about when you don't need the data. One of the last bits of the research was this sort of slides that I had for them was, do you have to do this research? And if so, does it have to be you? Right. Is there someone else who's doing it, or is there someone else who's better? Is there someone that you could help them if you thought that you had a particular niche skill that would be useful? But not just something, oh, I think that's important, I can do that, because it's probably not always going to be the most helpful thing. And like it can cause real harm as well. Like I've got friends who work with people in particularly vulnerable positions, and people will just come in and be like, oh yeah, I want to talk to them, and I'm like, okay, why? And why do you think that you should be allowed to just go and talk to them? And thinking about the harm that can cause. Right. So I think reflecting that, and that's been a process for me as well, reflecting on like, what is the point? Like, because I agree with Kevin in the point where I'm a bit irritable of research that's just for other academic eyes, and like, because so the work I'm currently doing is focused on data collection. There is some purpose of other academics seeing it, because there's a lot of academics who ask questions on sex, gender and sexuality really poorly, so it'd be really good if they read my work. But by the same token, it's not only relevant to them, and I don't want it to just be something that's only read by other academics. So thinking about how to get out and engage, and how to sort of, as I was saying, like, serve my participants. Like, you've given me this information, this is how I'm actually going to try and get it out there a little bit. But yeah, that's a lot of responsibility, but I feel like part of like what you're doing, what's the whole point of it.
Absolutely. Do you have anything you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I won't repeat what you're saying, Kirsty, but I absolutely on the same page on that front, right? Especially when you're talking about kind of recognizing your own positionality in that sense. I think even when we're talking within a community or within a impressed group, because of the fact that we are so diverse, so kind of multiple within those spaces as well, that it's worth recognizing that. I think the other thing there is kind of that also helps a little bit to push back on the idea that that in a research project you hire one person of color or you hire one queer person and say, okay, well now we've done it, right? And it's like, aside from all of the tokenistic stuff about that, and what is the actual power dynamic there? Is you got one person, and that person represents a small part of what you're talking about, right? Especially I think we see that in like stakeholder sessions or stuff like that, or especially the leadership of stakeholder sessions and things like that, where it's not representative because of the fact that it's that you've decided one person can represent everyone. There's so much pressure to be under anyway. And I think the other side of it is just that on the advocacy side, I would say that thing of recognizing when your moment to step away is a difficult, like, that's probably the space where people get most defensive, and even if that's not necessarily what you're saying, but it is the assumption very quickly, right? If you've made your life inequalities work in an inequalities area that has nothing to do with your own lived experience, it can be threatening to hear the community that you're supposed to be working for saying, hey, it's not okay that we're never represented in the leadership of the processes that are supposed to support us. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to call in the voice of Autumn Brown, who's this amazing anti-oppressive facilitator and teacher, and she talks about the acronym WAIT, W-A-I-T, why am I talking? And I have that in my back pocket all the time. So it's not just for before you open your mouth, but even maybe while you've opened your mouth or stepped into something, is like, wait, why am I talking? What do I have to contribute here? What role can I play in supporting people reach their destination instead of taking the lead in that? Thank you both for that. One last question for both of you. So the book presents us with a kind of double bind of being visible and legible to the state, but being visible through flattening and dehumanizing categories and labels. What do you see as the relationship between research and data collection and making the lives and experiences of marginalized people more visible? What are the risks in that?
Yeah, I think there's so many things in that side of things, right? Like, I think what it immediately makes me think of, because I think we can dive into the side of the flattening, and I think we talked about it already now a little bit, right? Of that often when we're talking about Black or POC folks, or we're talking about other oppressed groups, that we just say, okay, well, here we've come with a category, right? And we're working on that category, and there's really, in the way you were talking about the census data before as well, right, is one of the biggest exercises in really doing that kind of work. But what we've also found in iOS is research can, in a sense, or that process of distancing what one is advocating about a little bit from oneself can also be a really good way of, I mean, I guess engaging with your first question there, of kind of like, self-care, or like surviving in that space for a longer period of time. Because, I mean, really one of the key things that we would push for is stopping stakeholder sessions or research being this space that's about marginalized people putting out all their traumas on a table to be dissected, and then especially with the rest of the power dynamics that we've talked about, and that is very much the case as it is right now, right? But being able to have a piece of research, and even in that sense, that categorization to some extent, is, I guess that's where the nuance and stuff comes in that you were talking about before, right? Is also a way of being able to say, I'm here talking about all of this community's different experiences. Some I can recognize, some are different. They're all important, they're bound together maybe by something, and that's what I'm pushing for. And it's just, it can feel safer in that space, and it can help you be there longer.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, I think about this quite a lot in terms of like what visibility and like data means, and like why would we want that, or do we want that? And so like from a personal point of view, I originally got into my line of research because I was irritable at terrible questions in the census and population surveys more broadly, and just general terrible survey questions. Even when you're like signing up for a Tesco club card, it gives you like, it's like, what's your sex? I'm like, I'm neither of them. So I'm someone who wants this representation. I had a lot of participants who also wanted this representation. But there's the caveat of risk there. And I think I don't think my perspective has changed, but I think I became more pessimistic during the pandemic about it, because I think that in an ideal world, a government would be here to meet our needs, and we'd look at the data and be like, okay, we have this many people, we have to do these things to meet their needs, but that's not how it works. So I see visibility in data, the value of it I see is more for our communities to know ourselves, and how can we use that data to meet our needs. And the kind of, I think the big issue as well is this assumption that like I very much believe that there is no objectively perfect set of questions. But by that, what I mean is that the questions have to change over time and they have to change over place. That does not mean, oh, well, this is the best we could do. And the best you could do is often binary, it's often rigid. One of the things I get overly irritable about recently is the tick one. And I was like, I'm 4 of them.
Right.
I was like, so no, I can't tick one. Like, tick your favourite one then. I was like, there's not a favourite one. And like that, this sort of detachment from, like, they'll try and claim that, oh, the data is the objective reality, but it's the complete detachment of how a lot of people experience so sex, gender, sexuality in my work, but this relates to a lot of different sort of equality statistics. So I think challenging this sort of complacency is like the first step. So first off, if they're going to be asking the questions, they better be better ones than what they've been asking. And second off, when it comes to the visibility, I think in the long run, like, it can be beneficial in the sense that, like, if we know who people are, we can we might know their needs. But I think in the here and now, for example, visibility, like, trans women are hyper visible, but that does not necessarily translate to power or to rights or to just like basic respect from people. So that this whole idea that, oh, if we're visible, then that'll be fine, and that includes in the data. And when you were asking Kevin earlier about expectations for the census, I both think there'll be an undercount, but I also think people will be going, oh, this is a tiny group who don't matter, but also there's too many of them. I was like, but at the same time, they'll say it in the same breath. So that visibility there and like how that will be treated will be mistreated regardless of what we do and how good the data is. But there's also questions of how we can use the data if we make it for our needs.
Right, perfect.
I might to add just a small point based off what you're saying there. I mean, think of like, I think part of the thing when we're talking about visibility is that it can often be talked about in quantitative ways, right? Or it's like, okay, we're visible because we know there are this many people and we can count them. I guess especially since we're talking censuses, right? But a lot of the time, in the way we found it is it's often really about the quality of the data that's coming there, right? I mean, in a sense, I absolutely agree when it comes from kind of the race perspective. There's lots of data out there that you could already be working from, and you don't need to start from scratch again. And yet, so much of that data, I would be like, well, it really had nothing to do with the community that it was researching, et cetera, and that's also visibility, right? That being able to see yourself in the data that has been made of you, like about you, is also a really important part of visibility in that sense.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we can turn over to the audience now. I don't know if Mary's around or if you want to take another wee break before we do that.
Yeah, can you?
Okay, and just a reminder to everyone online that you can submit questions on the event webpage. Is that right? So the Lighthouse Bookstore event webpage. Mary's keeping an eye out for all your questions coming in, and people in the room as well. So we'll take a beat, maybe a minute or two, and then pick up again with the audience. Perfect. Thank you. try to transcribe as best I can.
I'm going to ask the first one from online, which is from Data Science.
Oh.
As inclusive data collection becomes more adopted by governments and mainstream large-scale surveys, how do you see the role of LGBTQ community organizations changing?
Ooh, okay. So how is more adoption of data collection changing LGBTQ groups or
Community. Oh, I lost it. Yeah, how is it changing the role of LGBT community organizations?
Okay. So how is more adoption of data collection changing the role of LGBTQ community organizations? Aha, who wants to kick off there? That's a juicy one.
Yeah, I'm happy to go
Yeah.
second or go first, I don't know. I can say something, I guess, very quick on that. Thank you, was it Data Science, for the question. My only quick point on that would be, I've seen some interesting work around kind of working within systems versus working outside of systems, and when you're trying to work within systems, to what extent do you need to use the language of the system you're working in? So for example, big mainstream LGBTQ organisations, whether they're in the UK or Europe or the US, if you're engaging with legislators, politicians, governments, to what extent do you need to kind of walk the walk and talk the talk to try and bring about certain outcomes and certain outputs? But by kind of walking the walk and talking the talk, are you actually losing something in the process?
Right.
And we think of that particularly with methods. So actually, if you realise that all of the legislators you're engaging with really listen to quant data, they really want stats, numbers, surveys, actually that's doing a real disservice to other types of research that can really show and showcase other lives and experiences.
Yeah.
So I think it's something for both LGBTQ groups and other representative organisations to be mindful of, that yes, it's beneficial to kind of speak in the language of the structure and the institution, but also make sure you're not losing too much along the way.
Right, right.
So yeah, the first thing that came to mind for me for that question was the way that LGBTQ plus organisations have had to, like, although, like, so for example with the Census, there's obviously a lot of work surrounding trying to, like, in the design process of that, happening from like NRS and the government, the LGBTQ plus organisations are having to do their own work to kind of engage with that and trying to make sure that vigorous work is being done. So it's kind of interesting at this point. So it's not just that this is stuff that's already out there, it's the stuff that's actively being designed at this point. And I think we've also got the Section Gender Data Working Group as well. So there's a particular focus on the design process just now that's occurring. And yeah, as you were saying as well, there's an element of, through that process of, oh well, they've started using this term, we have to just use this term so they understand what we're meaning. But that term has so many poor assumptions on it. The one that comes to mind currently is the use of the term in the Scottish context, legal sex. Is that they all talk about legal sex. It's not a thing. It's like, what they mean is if you've got a GRC or what's on your birth certificate, but what that then comes with implications that, oh, there's then this that comes with certain rights or certain access. That's not the case. So the way it's been used comes with all these assumptions, and having to meet them there does really limit the sort of what can be done. But yeah, I don't know if that went off topic there, sorry.
No, not at all. Do you have a contribution? No.
Yeah, I mean, I guess directly to the question, I think I'm not like in the space to be able to kind of say exactly, right? But I think in relation to what you're saying there, Kirsty, I think that I think talking from the race side in terms of that categorization, that kind of like labeling and use of terms, that we sit in that space that, you know, the terms that are used for Black and POC people is BAME, Black and Ethnic Minority, right? Or minority ethnic, and recognizing that that's not how we would go about thinking about that. That's, you know, that's really a minority rights lens. It has nothing to do with a racial lens. We're talking about white minorities as well in there, which isn't helpful for anybody, white minorities or Black and POC folks. Is like when it then comes, how does that change the role of the community organization? Is to like even if it might be a victory to have, you know, that categorization has gotten you victories, has gotten you kind of things that can be useful. That is still all right to keep pushing. That something new needs to come. You know, like we've talked about a few times. It's an iterative process where we just because something has come doesn't mean that there isn't a next stage to push for.
Right.
And then just force them to use it. I don't know. That's usually what we've done. You know, whether it's fundraising or whether it's in the space, they'll keep on saying BAME and you keep on saying Black and POC, and eventually they realize that they should stop.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
We go to one in the room.
Yeah, cool. That was amazing. I've never nodded so hard at a book launch. So you opened your acknowledgements in the book that saying like the queer data is dedicated to those not in the room when decisions are made about them, and you talked about more action and change being messy and complicated. I'm interested to know if you have any thoughts on how to approach action, particularly when there are multiple potential courses of action to take, and data shows that there might be different preferences for that course of action.
Okay, so how to approach action when there are multiple courses to take. And what was the last bit?
And data might suggest that there are different preferences.
And data might suggest there are different preferences to approaches.
Okay, I can make a start on that. Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question about action because, so the book's kind of got three parts, one about collection, one about analysis, one about use, presentation, action. And I think that final third stage we often forget about. I think people working with data, it's all about how do we design methods, how do we design questions, how do we then crunch the numbers. And we don't often think about how do we communicate it or use it or present it or visualize it. And I think some of the most interesting work is in that final space, particularly as you're saying, there are a variety of paths we could go down with this, whether how we're using the data, for what purposes are we using the data. Increasingly, as I kind of mentioned, my interest in how people use maybe data about minoritized groups or LGBTQ lives for bad purposes. So actually for agendas that are against what we want or what's going to kind of improve our lives. So I think that's really where politics comes into it, around the path that you choose for the action that you follow. So in the kind of, I think, one of the final chapters, I look at how do we speak about data, how do we communicate data, who has a voice in these discussions, whose voice matters. And I think it was a really fantastic discussion in the panel earlier about who has that space to speak and who should be speaking and whose voice is valued in these conversations. And I think that all plays into that path that we follow, the use for action. So I would love to see more work on it, actually, less on the kind of ins and outs of collection and more about how do we present our research findings, how do we speak about them, how do we write about them, I think is a really interesting space.
Yeah, I think for this one, I think what you were saying earlier, Kevin, about like the main thing that came to mind with like data collection being used to kind of delay things. The big thing that came to mind for me was the current discussion surrounding banning gay conversion therapy. Like, we need more evidence. I was like, well, it's like, you know, it's considered torture internationally. I think torture is bad. There's probably enough evidence of what we need. What they mean by that is, we need evidence on how we can do it in a way that means that conversion therapy for trans people is okay. That's what they want. That's what they mean. Yeah, so like kind of be able to point, like, so challenging stuff, like when they say we need more evidence, like, we've got tons. Like, I'm personally always tempted to just print off all of the evidence, just like, so come with like, it's bad. But then there's also the thought that comes to mind with like, particularly looking at when they start talking about the size of a group, and then they're like, oh, well, it's a very small group, we shouldn't have to meet their needs. I'm like, oh, but there's also about the impact of what we're talking about, and it not just being if there's enough of them, we'll do this for them. Right. And also talking about like what, like actually focusing in on what's actually being discussed. So for example, if it's like we're discussing like access to food, that's a major issue. And if like oh well, it's only this specific small, I'm like, no, that's actually quite a big issue. If it happens to anyone. that's actually a widespread, massive issue just now, but that was the first thing that came to mind. But yeah, so not just being about the size of group, meaning like, oh, if they're big enough, then we can worry about them. So kind of dive more into the qualitative data and about what's actually occurring, and kind of being quite loud about that is the main thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe following a little bit on from what you're saying there, Kirsty, is that, and also that, like, just responding directly to that, it's in a sense the numbers don't matter. Like, it doesn't. Okay, it's a small group. The point is we're talking about an oppressive structure and an oppressive society.
Right.
How, like, changing that is in everyone's interests.
Yeah.
Life doesn't work that there's a small quantity of people who want a thing, and then that's how it works, right? But I think, I don't know if that's a perfect answer to your question, but I feel like maybe that's just from where I'm coming, well, you know, where I'm coming from. But I feel like the action is kind of the natural endpoint always of what the research is for. That's what's kind of what it's geared towards. If you've got if, for example, we're talking about community organizations who are involved in that process, it's already, like, their whole purpose is to figure out, okay, these are the things we need to do, and support other organizations to do some of those actions, directly advocate for some of them. So I think that's kind of almost a non-answer there, but yeah, they're just not separate to the research. I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin. Right, Mary. Who's next?
Okay, who's next? Paul Daly is next, who is the Policy and Research Manager at LGBT Youth Scotland. And he has two questions.
Yep.
So I'll start with the first one. Thinking about the census this year, wondering if you have any reflections on other countries that have recently added GI or SO questions, and what helped encourage engagement from the LGBTQI community. Does anyone have a...
What was that last bit? What helped?
Any other countries that have recently added GI or SO questions, and what helped encourage engagement from the LGBTQI community?
Okay, so this is a question about reflections on other countries, including questions about
Gender identity and
Gender.
sexualization.
And sexual identity, and what helped to get people to engage in that process. Yeah.
Do you want to kick off?
So for me, whenever this is maybe about the nature of my work, but whenever the international context comes up, it's always about problems of other places' censuses. I know there. I think that emphasis on how the data can be used for not just by the government. The government needs to know this about you, that kind of thing, but actually for the community. So LGBT Scotland, if they were to say about exactly how they can use the information from the census to then meet the needs of LGBT young people in Scotland, that would be a really good way to motivate people to participate. Because I think one of the things that my participants talk about a lot is they just not knowing why the information is being asked about, because they're like, oh yeah, I would answer that question in some context if I understand why they're asking it. But if it's just like, oh, we're asking this because we think that's important about you, that's like, or we think this is the main crux of who you are, like no, that's not. Or if it's just data to go nowhere, like some of the surveys that I looked at, like big population surveys, and I would find, oh, that's actually quite a good gender question, well done, but the data goes nowhere. It's not in any reports. Yeah. It's not shared anywhere. So I'm like, that was useless data you've asked for. And I got the sense from the participants they really don't want that. So just emphasising specific reasons, specific ways that the data is used. And I've seen, like ONS down south have done like testimonies as to why different bits of data in the census has been used. I think that can be quite effective. I would say that it's maybe not spread widely enough. I would say for specific communities actively, so like LGBT organisations actively engaging with LGBT people, but like these are ways that we would use this information, not just hypothetically, oh, it's useful for a reason. But like, yeah.
Yeah, I can say a bit on that. That's, I guess, the bigger question is, how do we engage communities in research? How do we get people to give up their time, share their experiences, share their information with somebody collecting, whether a survey or a census. I think the specific example around the census is maybe hard to answer. I think the UK is the first country to ask a question about sexual orientation. I believe Malta has now added a question on sexual orientation. So there's really no clear model to copy in other countries. As many countries ask questions about gender identity, but again, I wouldn't want to say what Census did in, say, Nepal or India or Pakistan is what we should replicate or copy and paste to the context in Scotland. I do think one country that's done some work on it is the US. So their LGBTQ rights groups, although the census doesn't ask a question about sexual orientation, it does ask questions about same-sex relationships. So the LGBTQ task force in the US has done a really good job of trying to kind of get out the count. I think they had a big campaign around queering the count. And I think from their work, they saw that positive messaging was really key. So actually highlighting, rather than focusing, as I often do, on the negatives or the challenges and the barriers, that's not the message to get folk to engage in a census. You have to be thinking about the stories about being counted, being represented. And I think for me as well, the historical dimension is really key. I can imagine somebody in 100 years opening up my census file and being, here's the life of me, and that being recorded that I'm a kind of gay man. And I think that's a real meaningful dimension that I hope and think that Scotland might tap into when the census takes place in March.
Yeah, I think on exactly the question as it is, I'm just going to chime in on the part about copying and pasting from other countries, and I guess for me, being half Indian, that India would be the example I used there. That it just adding to what you're saying there, right? That we're talking about a totally different historical context. So there are things to learn from each other, but there's also just like being aware that we're talking about a totally different space, right? If you're talking about trans rights in India, there's a totally different history to what you're engaging with, and so that engagement with the census looks totally different, or with any research. And then just answering your version of the question in that sense as well about how can we kind of support and engage communities in just engaging in research. One thing that we've pushed quite hard at IOS, not so surprising considering the organization we are, is the importance of the trust relationship between community organizations and the communities that we're working with, right? There's so often research is done, it goes back to the power dynamic really, right? So research is done in this kind of really distanced way. It's done by institutions that we already have bad histories with, that definitely stretches across like all kinds of different oppressed groups, right? Of one of the most recent pieces of research that we've done in IOS is around race and mental health. And the question that we would often get, I guess, from mental health services or practitioners that are kind of like in the mainstream in that sense, is why is it that Black and POC people don't, there's a trust gap, there's an engagement gap or something like that, right? They're failing to use these services that you should be using, right? I'm sure this is recognizable language.
Hard to reach.
And exactly, hard to reach, right? And at the end of the day, that's we can't just see it as, okay, these are all of the violences that the medical sector, that hospitals and all this space have done on us, and that's one thing. And then separately, here is no one is engaging with these services.
Right.
It matters. Those things have an impact, and then when you get into what are you going to do about it, how are you going to then make sure that there is support that's useful? First of all, you have to change the way the support works, because it's still all of that messy stuff. And second of all, you have to kind of, I guess they kind of tie into each other, right? Like if you're doing it through community organizations that are already pushing for these kinds of things, then the way it's going to look is going to be totally different as well. So difference between engagement and kind of hard to reach.
Yeah, well, I just keep coming back as I'm hearing you answer all these questions. I keep coming back to these things that are typically missing, like a feedback loop. These simple things that people just, or organizations or researchers just don't do. And that further erodes that feeling of trust. Anyway, okay, sorry.
Another one in the room before I ask one.
I have one. So thank you, Kevin, and to everyone else on the panel as well. So just today I was actually reading an oral history with a black woman who was involved in kind of some of the first Black women's organisations in the UK who was very involved in campaigning against the introduction of ethnicity monitoring in the 1980 census. And I guess we can kind of think of, obviously this is historical, but right now we can think of migrants and even British citizens whose status is increasingly insecure who might have an interest against being counted.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if people on the panel could kind of reflect a bit on that, and I guess the role of kind of positionality in wanting to be counted. Yeah.
All right. So the role of positionality in wanting to be counted, and a question about thinking of the interests of people who are against being counted. Thank you. Whew.
I'm happy to jump.
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
with something.
please do.
So as I said, I'm half Indian. The other half is Danish. So I'm going to take an example from there that really ties into what you're saying there, I think. For a really long time, we had a category about housing, essentially, like areas of Copenhagen that was built into systems that provided more funding for that category. Essentially, what we're talking about with the category is just like disenfranchised areas, let's say. I'm translating a little bit, right? But it's essentially here, there's a bunch of migrants here. And at first, it was used as a way of kind of funneling resources towards that space. Now, it's used for policing. It's used as a way to police migrant communities, right? So there's a real risk inside of that. I guess I'm really just highlighting the danger that can come, right? And that the person that you're talking about was kind of pushing on, right? To me, it's part of the fabric of kind of us advocating and fighting for social justice in the kind of the whole political landscape. I totally understand the organizations and the activists who pushed for using this for funding there. You also, and we need to in this moment, also kind of be wary and be sure that we know that we can kind of set limits to how that is used, that we don't see it as just, okay, here this allows funding and that means that everything's great, but that there's other areas to the activism that we're doing. It's not a perfect answer, but I think part of the way that Denmark got to that place is about the whole political dynamic of Denmark. And I don't know, that's pretty much what I got there. A little mixed answer on that one, but just acknowledging the importance of what you're actually saying there, and the fact that we kind of should have to be wary about it.
I think it's a really interesting example. I did not know about that in Denmark. I kind of, when you asked the question, I thought about the US Census in 2020. So in the run-up to the census in the US, Trump, who was president at the time, was making a big push to ask a question on migrant status. Again, a very political question about which we then have this record of people's migrant status across the country. So I think it does underscore the politics behind these systems and these institutions and these structures. But I do find it weird with my work around LGBTQ data how rarely the history of data about LGBTQ communities is spoken about, and how that history is not necessarily a positive history. So I mean, even recent history, quantitative data about LGBTQ groups was used as evidence of criminality, of psychological maladjustment, of being something wrong or something outside of the norm. So actually, historically, our relationship to these practices and these systems and these institutions is not a positive relationship. And I do think we are asking and expecting a lot for people to switch gear very quickly and go, hold on, this institution, which until very recently was all about policing me or criminalising me or painting me as some kind of psychological deviant, now wants data from me for another purpose. Right. I think that switch is sometimes quite hard, and it isn't really spoken about. I think in that kind of, as you're mentioning, around race and the relationship between race and data and institutions, I think there's some commonalities around sexual minority communities as well, and that's problematic history.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. So as I think I said earlier, most of my participants were very much in favour of more representation. I did have one focus group participant who was very wary of how the data would be used, but not just like currently, but long term. So things like the census, like when you think about the previous question about how to encourage people to respond to the things like the census, one of the things that will be said will be, oh, well, it's anonymised for 100 years. And they're very strict about that, and they are very strict about that. I've got very good faith that I know that my census result will not be de-anonymised or identifiable for 100 years. However, this particular participant was like, well, governments change. And what would, if the government was like, actually no. And like who would hold them account, and that kind of, and that concern there is legitimate, and also like that's one particular example of data. There's other forms of data collection that don't have as rigorous protections on it. I am absolutely terrified in the aftermath of Brexit when they talk about getting rid of the red tape of GDPR, and like the newspapers talk about it as if it's a little bit of like, oh, that's a small admin bit of news. It's like, oh no, that's just like, that's the equivalent of just like, I'm going to break down your door and take photos of you on the toilet. That's what I'm going to do. That's so like it is a worry, and it's also it's a big reason as to why I'm not in favour of mandatory questions in any sort of data collection exercise. If you're so all forms of data collection should be done via consent, and that should be informed onto what the data's going to be used for, and there should be some sort of like and like ways to ensure that. But like there is always that concern that they'll just go, oh well, never mind. I'm just going to do what I want with it. So that is something to be aware of, and something I feel like I've got more pessimistic of over the last 2 years.
Perfect, thank you. And that ended us right on time. We're at 8:30, if you can believe it.
Do we have, does anyone have to run, or can we, I think there were 2 more questions.
Sure, are you all okay with that?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if anyone at home needs to tune off, they can watch afterwards.
Perfect.
It's all recorded.
Yeah, perfect. Let's do it.
Was there someone else? Did you have a question as well? No. Okay, so just the one. Emily is being very persistent.
Oh, okay.
I think it's a short one. Would love to hear the panelists' thought around payment and incentives for participation. It seems to be something that there is very little consensus of in both the public and private sector.
This is my hot button issue. So this is a question about payment and incentive for research participants. Who wants to kick that one off? I'm not going to get involved.
I have lots of thoughts. I was saying to you earlier, one of the benefits of there's been very little benefits of things having to move online, but for my research in particular, it moved online, and then I was in the early design stage of my research, and I was like, oh great, I am no longer moving around to see participants. That money is going right to participants now. That was that should have been the choice originally. Like I'm glad that I'm hopeful I would have got to that conclusion anyway, because like that meant I could pay them for their time, and I could pay them like in regards to the Scottish living wage, and that. So sometimes you hear people saying like, oh well, that sounds like it could become like you're just it's you're influencing them, and I was like, they don't know what I think. I'm not going to tell them like, oh by the way, right, so answer this way. I'm not that bad a researcher, and also they get paid regardless of what they say. And if you're not doing it, then that limits who can be in the room, and that's the main issue for me. Is if you're not paying for things, and this goes for other things as well, like who can actually speak in any given situation. If you're not providing financial incentive, then it limits who can do things, and this also goes to I'm someone from a working class background. I did a lot of like internships and stuff like that during my undergraduate degree. I could only do that because they paid properly. If they didn't pay properly, I'm like, I'm not doing an unpaid internship. Of course not. Yeah. I was like, that's not happening. I don't have the time to be working for free. So then who gets in the room for these things? And I think about that a lot with academic research. Who gets to so I'm also relatively privileged position now of I've been in like elite academic institutions for years, but there's also like there's certain types of work, so like work relating to like sex specifically, like as in like sex acts and stuff, is often considered like dirty work in research, and you'll find work that people who talk about how, oh, the first limitation for this work was getting EFCO approval. I'm like, no. First limitation is getting funding. I was like, I need funding for this. I've not got a permanent post. And so who gets, that's kind of going off topic, but generally, like if there's not resources put behind something, only people who don't have to worry about that will be able to be there. And that then limits whose voices are being heard.
Yeah.
All I can add is just, this is like the number one question. So I think to Emily, I'm kind of sensing this frustration from online. I'm just feeling the same frustration here. I don't have any answer to this at all, aside from we're all, I think, whether it's universities, private sector, public sector, we're nowhere near where we need to be in regards to acknowledging how we meaningfully recognise the contributions of research participants and those involved in our work. I think we are starting to have that conversation, and I often find myself being the voice in the room who goes, we need to pay these people who are giving up their afternoon to come and speak to us. But I'm often the lone voice, and I think I don't have an answer to it, aside from the fact that it's a problem. It's a massive problem, and I don't think it's being discussed enough among people, whether it's practitioners, researchers, policymakers. How do we meaningfully, not actually get a report at the end of the day or they get PDF sent, how do we meaningfully compensate folk for their time?
No, I think I will add to the stall that is in favor of paying participants. First of all, I guess as from that understanding in iOS that we have about what research is, participants and researchers, especially like, we'll have like youth researchers, people involved in the research process throughout the whole go. So that already pushes you more towards, well, if someone is doing research, then they should be paid for the job that they're actually doing. I think the other thing on that one is, it comes back to that where we're talking about hard to reach communities and stuff like that. I think when it comes to silencing people in research, one of the major ways it happens is in that moment when you're thinking about what research should I do as an organization or an individual, and like that's too difficult. And paying people for their time seems to be too difficult. And then finally, sorry, I know there's 3 points here actually in response, but the last one is just zooming it out a little bit more as well, and saying there seems like there's a very clear ideology there of presuming that being unpaid makes data more authentic. And we can see that in a way that's not just research. Like in iOS, we sit in government kind of stakeholder spaces, in like anti-racist change spaces and stuff like that. And those are also spaces where the presumption is that everyone is there on a voluntary basis, in the sense of an unpaid basis, but it's not true. There's a good chunk of people who are there and are in paid positions to do so. When I'm there, I'm in a paid position to do so. And there are other Black and POC activists in those spaces who are not. And that means fundamentally you're going in there in a totally different space. Someone gets put in their workday and the other person has to make everything work around it. And I don't think it's very far away from the question of paying participants, because it's that ideology in the background of it's more authentic if we don't pay anyone to do it. Which is kind of the opposite of the truth. So.
I said I would keep out of it, and I lied. I just, two things for fellow researchers in government. One is, I really would like people to play with the idea of refusing to be paid that day as being a researcher if nobody is being paid who's participating in research. I would love to see a kind of movement around that, because bureaucratically they wouldn't be able to handle that either. So if they wanted to make an argument for it's too difficult to pay folks, well then try not paying me. How are you going to put that through the books? So that's one thing. The other is educate yourself a little bit about the benefit system, because I think one of the most often, things that you hear most often is we can't pay people because it might mess with their benefits, because you may well be working with people. So that's an old one. I think there are definitely ways around it if it is an issue, creatively or other. I've got a whole bartering system fantasy in my head for payment of participants. So I think there is room to push back and be creative and be a bit rabble-rousy about this. Oh. Is there any more questions?
Note to end on.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yes. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you for Lea for hosting
Yeah,
such a
this has
fantastic
been
tutoring
great.
job, and the panel. Thank you for
Thanks,
everything.
everybody.